Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second season of The Fourth Leg. This is your host, Philip Reiner. This series is focused on one of the most complex systems in the world today, nuclear command, control, and communications, and its increasingly complicated future. With this series, we're going straight to the experts across multiple sectors to discuss the technical and policy challenges associated with NC3. Specifically, here in Season 2, we will discuss the necessity for a secure global crisis communications capability. There's a great deal to cover, so let's get started. In keeping with the unique nature of our last episode, today's discussion is going to take a deep dive into another very technical subject, cryptography. In this season of The Fourth Leg, we're diving deeper into the emerging risks for 21st century NC3 modernization efforts. What is just as critical is the process that is needed to ensure international actors will trust this system. For that, we turn to Dr. Tom Berson, who has a lifetime of experience in cryptology and computer security. Tom is a well-known entrepreneur, cryptologist, and advisor to all number of startups, owns and runs his own Anagram Laboratories, and is an advisory board member and the chief security advisor at Salesforce. So how does a late 20th century block cipher competition play a role in nuclear crisis communications? Listen in to find out. So thank you, Tom, for joining us here today for the podcast. It's really fantastic to have you with us. We know how extremely busy you are, so we really appreciate your time.
I'm glad to be here this morning, Philip, and I want to thank you and your colleagues for pushing forward with your work despite the distractions of the pandemic.
Yeah, it definitely complicates things to a greater degree. So just to dive right in with you, we've held this series of discussions around the central idea of a CATALINK system that we developed in this workshop last fall. This is the idea that we can build a secure crisis hotline system that's radically simplistic, something that heads of state can use here in the 21st century. Your contribution to this effort was a discussion paper that focused on the history of one very specific NIST-run competition and how that competition potentially could serve as a model for us as we think through what to do in order to really to engender the integrity of a system like CATALINK so that leaders would actually want to use this, so that their people would actually trust its system. So for all of those listeners out there who do not know what that NIST-run competition was, this AES competition, and your role in that, and how at the time what was the requirement? Would you mind walking the listeners through what all of that was and kind of what you gave to us in the paper?
Yeah, sure. I can do that. First, as you know, the example that I gave in my paper was the AES competition. The AES project was a project that was run from 1997 through 2001 by NIST, the United States National Institute for Standards and Technology. And they ran a competition. It was open, transparent, international. And the objective of the competition was to design and select a standard block cipher, which came to be called AES, or the Advanced Encryption Standard. The competition was productive, engaging, educational, surprising, and successful. In 2001, NIST published the winner as a FIPS, a Federal Information Processing Standard, FIPS 197, and AES was quickly adopted as a basic cryptographic building block, and it's widely deployed today throughout the world.
And so one of the things that I don't think people understand, or a lot of people may not be familiar with, is really what was behind the need for that competition. Where did this requirement come from?
The requirement a block cipher is a basic cryptographic building block. Almost every crypto system in use today, be it for secure communications, for electronic commerce, for command and control of IoT or physical plant, uses a block cipher. And the block cipher, called DES, Data Encryption Standard, had been standardized by NIST in 1976. So 20 years later, roughly 20 years later, DES was obsolescent, not really good for new designs, because the parameters of DES were short compared with modern mathematical understanding and computational facilities. So DES had to be replaced. Everybody knew DES had to be replaced. When DES was first standardized, it was given a lifetime, and that lifetime was extended by NIST several times. And it was old and creaky, and no longer sufficiently secure for purposes that people wanted to use it for. And so what motivated AES was to find something to replace DES.
And that competition, I think one of the most important things of this, as we try to put it in our own context, was that was an international competition, but it was something that was actually run by NIST, right? So how did that actually work so that you have an international competition where you have all of these different players who are working together, but working at odds with each other to come up with the best solution? How did NIST make that work?
Well, NIST ran a series of workshops. The first one they ran was to come up with the criteria for AES. And they put an open call for papers and an open call for contributions internationally. And they invited people to come to, I think it was in Gaithersburg, as I recall, but maybe not, to come and say what they would like to see out of an AES. And people came and presented ideas to NIST. NIST digested those ideas and then published a Federal Register article which said, look, this is what we're going to have as AES. Here are the parameters of it in terms of key size, block size, in terms of security, in terms of performance, in terms of intellectual property entanglements. And then the game was on. So they started out by collecting internationally requirements. Then they had it open for everybody to compete. In the first round, they attracted a great many candidates. I think 15 candidates in the first round. And the way it worked is everybody who had a horse in the race was trying to knock the other horses out. And so everybody who had a candidate AES algorithm was analyzing not only their own, but also everybody else's, and trying to publish papers to show, oh, that guy over there is weak, that guy over there is non-performant.
Can I actually ask about that? That's something I've always been very curious about. How did that actually work? So as each team was going through their process, they were constantly publishing on what they were working on, or were there working groups that were ongoing where people were displaying what they are? I mean, during a competition, you don't necessarily want to show your competitor what you're coming up with, but yet it sounds like that was an iterative process between the teams.
In order to participate, you had to say what your algorithm was and what your analysis of it was and why you thought it was secure. This was part of the requirements to get into the competition. So these were all open and public. And then everybody had to go at everybody else's. And papers were published both in the open cryptographic literature and the general cryptographic literature. And also, NIST ran a series of workshops in which people got together and gave papers about essentially why their own was secure and why everybody else's wasn't. NIST narrowed the field of 15 to a field of 5, and then ultimately from those 5 selected a 1. Of the 5 finalists, they were all fine block ciphers, in my opinion. And it was surprising to me, and I think to many people, that the one that NIST chose to be AES, which was called Rijndael, 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 which was made by a pair of Belgian cryptographers, was one of only 2 finalists that had no U.S. authors. Rijndael is a beautiful sort of object of the sort that nobody had seen before as a cryptographic primitive. And they chose it. And there's a famous YouTube thing from the authors of Rijndael, and it's called How to Pronounce Rijndael. And you watch it, and they say, we're going to teach you how to pronounce Rijndael. AES. So they won, and a year later, it was published as a standard. And the uptake was very fast.
So I want to be sure, before I delve into that, how did somebody outside the U.S. end up winning a NIST competition? Before I go there, I wanted to ask a little bit more about the block cipher, because I'm guessing that there's listeners out there that may have a sense of what that means and how it actually works. I think might be useful. So encryption, decryption, block ciphers, block lengths, all of the rest of what into the requirements that were laid out by NIST. Can you walk the listeners through what is actually happening there? Why is it important? How does encryption actually work? With the depth of expertise that you bring to this, I think it'd be useful.
Yeah. Well, modern cryptography is deeply mathematical. but it's the mathematics of trust and betrayal. And so everybody, even if they're not a mathematician, has trusted somebody and been betrayed by somebody. And so I think everybody probably has an instinct for what trust and betrayal means. What a cipher tries to do is to encrypt some plain text into something called ciphertext under control of a parameter called the key. We're probably all familiar with the sort of single letter, single alphabet substitution ciphers that get published in the newspaper as so-called crypto quotes.
Yeah.
Where the trick is to discover where each letter of the alphabet has been mapped into a different letter for encrypting purposes.
Right.
And the idea is to try to discover the key, that is the mapping, in this case, from the plain text to the ciphertext. And if you discover that mapping, it can also work in reverse. And that's a process called encrypting. And if you go in reverse, take the ciphertext and map it back into the plain text, that's a process called decryption. Okay, that works one letter at a time. A block cipher works multiple letters or multiple bits at a time. So DES had a block size of 56 bits. No, I'm sorry, 64 bits. It would take 64 bits at a time under control of a key whose length was 56 bits and map the 64 bits of plain text into 64 bits of ciphertext. Now, both the block size and the key size of DES were viewed as too short. The block size because short blocks lead to something called a birthday bound attack, which I won't go into. And short keys allow people to exhaustively search through all the possible keys. The best known attack on DES was, for many years, just a so-called exhaustive search attack, where you try every key possible. And you expect to succeed after about trying half the keys. So if the key length is 56 bits, what's half of 2 to the 56th? It's 2 to the 55th. And so 2 to the 55th is a pretty big number. I'll tell you what it is in a moment. I'm going to calculate it. It's about 10 to the 16th. So it's like a 3 with 16 zeros after it. And that became too short. So one thing we wanted for AES was a longer key size. The key sizes required by NIST for AES were 128, 192, and 256 bits. So you'd think, oh, this isn't so much bigger than 56, but it is. It really is, because 2 to the 128 is about 10 to the 38th. So that's 10 with 38 zeros behind it. And 2 to the 256, which is how many keys there could be, is about 10 to the 77th. So these key lengths are too long for anybody to exhaust them in the lifetime of the universe.
So you have this very clear requirement laid down because of what is existent, has holes in it. It's gotten creaky, as you put it. They're able to derive this, but again, to come back to the core of the issue here is there's security concerns with DES that drives a large part of why AES was required. And NIST is a U.S. standards organization that's running this process. It's worked with a variety of, I'm guessing, international partners to set those requirements, right? But it's still a U.S. organization that's running the process. How did they build the trust in? Because this is something you talk about in your paper, and it's absolutely critical to this discussion we're having around CATALINK and hotlines. How did NIST go about building in the trust so that whatever came out of this process would be valid, would be taken seriously, it would have integrity built in?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that trust was important. And NIST had not established trust for DES. DES was made in a closed process. There was a single candidate for DES. It was supplied by IBM. And for many years after DES was published, there were conspiracy theories or concerns about DES that somehow NSA, the U.S. National Security Agency, had cobbled DES so that NSA could exploit it. To my mind, this inhibited the acceptance of DES for many years. Although, as time went on, it turned out that nobody could show that there was a backdoor in DES. And in fact, none was ever discovered. I think, to begin with, NIST, when it did it again, decided to be transparent in the process, decided to have multiple candidates, decided that they would open source, that every candidate had to be published for everybody else to inspect. And they did it in this quite open way. But I don't think that was just enough. They also worked hard to establish a community around the AES process and the AES standard. And they also ran the project in the community of cryptographers. So I've come to understand that a standard or a norm is not just words on a piece of paper or technical requirements, but also comes embedded in a community of people who worked together to create that norm or that standard, and who are invested in the history and the future and the safeguarding of that norm or standard as it goes out into the world.
So one of the things that was really highlighted by your paper and we talked about in the workshop is directly that. And, as you noted, you hadn't been able to actually be in the workshop, but your injection of that notion was part of the conversation as to what's really needed here. So the idea with CATALINK is to, as Eric Gross has pushed, is to really simplify the design and make it so that the software, the hardware, the firmware that is behind this small communications device that leaders could use at the moment of crisis is something that has gone through that same gauntlet that perhaps the AES block cipher did, where you've really tested out the security and reliability of the code, and you've tested out the ability for this thing to withstand attacks. The community that you're talking about, we went into a little bit with Ron Minnick last week, talking about the core boot community and the open source community that we would turn to and we would rely on for a lot of this conversation around what goes into something like CATALINK. So looking back at that cryptographic community, that was already existent before this AES competition, right?
Yeah, that's true. Starting in 1982, there have been a series of cryptographic conferences, and an association was formed to sponsor these conferences. That's the International Association for Cryptologic Research, IACR. And IACR has been holding cryptographic conferences at least 3 times a year since 1982. And the open purpose of the conference is to come and present papers. But the real purpose of the conference is to come and see all the other cryptographers. And these are attended by, in that era, they've been attended by, say, 300 to 500 cryptographers from academic circles, from industrial circles, and from government circles. So it's a strange combination of professors, distinguished engineers, and government cryptanalysts come together, listen to papers, drink wine on a lawn, go for walks on the beach, sleep in the dorms. And these are people who know one another over long periods of time, much longer than the AES competition, who knew one another for long periods of time, much longer than the AES competition. These conferences go on through today. The community is vibrant. There were years when the average age of the attendance in the conference was going up 1 year per year. So that is, the community was kind of aging out. But now the community has gone quite young, which is very good. And there's all kinds of students and early stage career people at the conference.
Would you say that community that exists today is still as open and engaged with standards organizations like NIST as they were back when AES, that competition was run?
I don't think much has changed. NIST is running a competition today called PQC, Post-Quantum Cryptography competition. And they have a slew of candidates, international candidates for PQC, for a post-quantum cryptographic algorithm, although NIST will choose several in this case, not just one. It'll choose several for different purposes. And I don't see any diminution in interest. People are not avoiding NIST.
Great. So I want to come back to the work they're doing today here in a little bit. I think that's absolutely critical to this. I want to seize on this conversation around community real quick. So as I noted, we've been talking to folks who are from the open source community. We're talking to folks who are coming from this international community of folks who work on things like core boot. The notion, though, is for something like CATALINK to work, you really have to foster a community of interest of people similar to like what you're talking about with the cryptographic community. You mentioned that such a community would really need to pull in, not as you just said with the cryptographic community, I think it's important, not just to those senior level experts and engineers, but military officials and policymakers. You see that is something that's critical. Is that something that can be engendered? Or in large part, are we simply just going to have to rely on communities that exist and kind of pull them together a little bit? Maybe worlds that otherwise wouldn't collide and have conversations between them.
Yeah, I see. So we had a simple problem. All we had to do was come up with an algorithm. You have a much more complicated problem, and you have to come up with a system. So you have a systems engineering problem to do. And so you not only have to solve the technical problems, but you also have to solve the policy problems. You have to solve the operational problems. You have to solve the economic problems. You have to solve the intelligence lost gain problems. And you have to solve them all, to my mind, simultaneously in order for CATALINK to be accepted and trusted amongst nations. And I don't see how you can do that if you don't create a community that includes representatives from all those various disciplines.
Yep. Yeah, they have to be in it together. And just to compound the problems that you were just noting, we're in the midst of a pandemic where a lot of the face-to-face engagement that you said was so important is going to be that much more challenging.
Right. So, I mean, we can't call a workshop in September and invite people in. I don't think anybody will come for that. But I think that one could envision an eventual workshop and begin to engage with selected sympathetic members of these various disciplines around planning for the workshop, around a call for papers, around choosing a venue, around the future of this. And so begin engaging now for an eventual face-to-face thing. Do I think a community of trust can be established without face-to-face meeting? I'm no sociologist, so I don't know. Kind of old-fashioned, so I think no. I like to see people face-to-face.
Yeah. Well, and we've recently seen a little bit of research that's been done on how much trust can be built through virtual engagements, and it's definitely more challenging. If I could come back to the technical element of this, something I think is really important in building this community that you're talking about is the requirements that you noted that were so clearly laid out before. In terms of cryptography for something like hotlines, can you speak from your vantage and your experience a little bit to what really would be required for this very simple approach to a hotline? What are the best ways of trying to encrypt something like that? And then I have a follow-on question once you have a chance to talk through that a little bit.
Okay. You have to tell me first whether the hotline is pairwise or has multiple communications, multiple parties, more than two parties communicating at the same time.
At its most basic level, the idea is to be able to create pairwise. Start with that.
Okay. Second question is it pairwise amongst participants whose identities are known ahead of time?
That is the idea, that there would be a key exchange in advance, yes.
Good. So that means that keys can be exchanged via diplomatic channels. Physically, for instance, via diplomatic channels. They don't have to be negotiated on the fly. And it also means that the only encryption and decryption that's needed is going to happen on the end devices. Right. In this case, to my mind, what you need is a block cipher. And is a block cipher and a key store. I was thinking about this last night, and it would be an interesting exercise to look at a modern end-to-end encrypted messaging system, such as Signal, and to say, what do we need for a hotline that Signal doesn't provide? There'd be pluses and minuses. What does Signal provide that we don't need for a hotline? So in other words, instead of running it from scratch, to take an existing thing that's known to work and has been under scrutiny for 10 years, because this is also very important. I totally agree with Eric if he said we have to keep it simple. We absolutely have to keep it simple. And it also has to be secure. So it's easy to design a system. What's hard to do is to get anybody to analyze it. So one approach is to choose a system that exists and has been under analysis and to adapt it to our purposes, if possible.
And this actually leads me to my follow-on question with this, was that in your paper, you note that a system like this would probably not require new cryptography. That, and this is something we're talking to Eric about. Eric has thrown some ideas together on what the cryptographic backend of this might need to look like. In light of all that's happening, and this starts to lead us down into the conversation about the post-quantum discussion, why did you feel like, when thinking about this, that new cryptography wouldn't be necessary. And maybe it's because you were thinking about what exists could be built off of or adjusted for this requirement. What was the basis for thinking that nothing new really was needed?
Well, because we know how to build pairwise end-to-end encryption systems today. So what new do we need? And the fact that it's amongst an a priori known group of communicants that only needs to provide pairwise encryption, it's a solved problem. To my mind, it's a solved problem in terms of the cryptography. What may not be a solved problem is in terms of the whole systems engineering. For instance, the secure boot is so important because many systems are broken not because the cryptography is broken, but because the implementation is broken. Because the cryptography is on a platform which is built on marshmallows, and the marshmallows get exploited. So the idea is to build a platform out of steel and put the cryptography on top of that. That's what the secure boot community is interested in. The notion that, of course, we can't communicate if there's no communications channel. This is what Paul Bracken is talking about when he says we have to maintain communications. So these are other problems. They're not cryptographic problems, but they are systems problems. And in terms of post-quantum, well, here's what's happening. People are working on quantum computation. When a practical quantum computer exists, it will threaten all the currently known algorithms that are used for public key cryptographic operations, such as Diffie-Hellman and RSA. The purpose of NIST's previously mentioned PQC competition is to come up with algorithms which will allow public key operations even when a quantum computer exists. When a quantum computer exists, it doesn't do much against block ciphers. There's an algorithm called Grover's algorithm, which will run on a quantum computer and which reduces the search space or reduces the amount of work required to search a key from a block cipher to the square root of the key length. So if you're using, for instance, AES with 256 bits, so you now have 128 bits of work to do. 128 bits of work is still an impractical amount of work. So in an end-to-end crypto system for known people, for people who are known ahead of time, and when you do the key distribution ahead of time, there's no need to use public key cryptography for that encryption. So quantum computer does not threaten such a design. I would still say that you should make the system cryptographically agile. That is, we can't predict the future. We have no crystal ball. Something may happen to AES, if we use AES, for example. Something may happen to AES. And so the protocols that we use and what I would recommend have a version number in them so that we can upgrade the system to use a different algorithm in the future. In other words, I wouldn't paint myself into a corner, but I wouldn't think that a hotline of the sort that you're talking about needs to be threatened by a quantum computer.
That's really helpful to help kind of understand what it is that you were asserting there. The reliability and integrity piece of this. So the question comes back up with what's existing, if that's what's built into this hotline, is that, from your perspective, a cryptographic solution that people around the world would be willing to trust, or are those who are out there who wouldn't even really trust what exists today and would really demand something of their own?
Well, people may demand something of their own. And people may demand something of their own for out of purposes of national pride or paranoia. And to address those people, what I would say is, okay, we have a way to cascade cipher algorithms together. And there's a theorem called the Maramasi theorem that says that a cascade, by a cascade, I mean, first you encrypt it in algorithm A, then you encrypt it in algorithm B, then you encrypt it in algorithm C. All right. So the Maramasi theorem says in such a cascade, the security of the cascade is no worse than the security of the first one that you hit. So what I would say to anybody who wanted for national purposes to have their own algorithm used, say, okay, well, give us your algorithm and we're going to add it to the cascade. So say first you do AES and then you do, let me say, Elbonia crypt standard, and then you do Zendia crypt standard. And is it slower? Yeah, it's slower. But modern processors are sufficiently fast to do what's needed to be done here.
Yeah, I think the question goes back to this idea of trust and integrity built into the device and the back end, making sure that, say, if the Americans are okay with it, would the Russians be okay with it? Would the Chinese be okay with it? That's an interesting approach that that had not come up in our conversations, that cascading.
So what was done in the initial Moscow-Washington hotline, what I understand was done, was that one-time pad was used. And this is a perfectly secure crypto system. It's widely understood by everybody. Everybody can provide their own one-time pad. It doesn't reveal anything about national cryptographic capability. It does, however, require a very long key. It requires to distribute key which is as long or longer than the sum of all the messages you're ever going to send is long. So that's a disadvantage of that. It's logistically difficult to do. But you raised an interesting point about, let's talk about the US, China, and Russia. So suppose we have a CATALINK system, and suppose Russia decides to use it to talk to China. How does the US feel about those comms? Is the US interested in what Russia is saying to China? Yes, I'm sure they are. And the same for any other dyad. So this tells me that the CATALINK system will be an object of great interest to cryptanalytic and intelligence agencies in every one of the nations who are going to be using it, and probably into other nations as well. And I think this needs to be acknowledged and to affect the requirements and process by which the system is created up front.
One of the conversations that came up in the workshop was, in order to create a trustworthy and reliable system, there may be elements of this that could work against you as a nation in thinking about its own security. The nuclear risk reduction upside was enough to, at least in our discussions, was enough to push this forward. And if you can potentially reduce the risk of nuclear war between India and Pakistan, while perhaps the Chinese won't be able to hear their conversation or to know what they're talking about, we've reduced the risk of nuclear confrontation. So it's a definite trade-off, and it's definitely something that came up in the workshop. I think the interesting piece of that, though, goes back to what we were talking about before, which is having participants in this from the outset who are from each of these disparate countries, so that they are a part of the conversation from the beginning. And really, that's one of the huge takeaways that we found from your description of AES and how it was successful, was because it allowed it to be transparent, and it allowed for those sorts of inputs from the outset, from the people who could really determine whether or not this was something that could be trusted.
Yeah. What I didn't mention about AES is that NSA, there were people in NSA who wanted to put their own candidate algorithms in. And the management of NSA thought long and hard about this and decided no, because of the both real and apparent conflict of interest. It would have thrown the whole competition, the outcome of the whole competition, into doubt.
Yeah. And I think that's actually an outstanding question for us. And I'd be curious as to your thoughts on this in terms of any process that we run. And in the first podcast, we spoke with John Gower from the UK, Rear Admiral John Gower, about this. The idea here is potentially to find someone to help lead the effort, to help coordinate the discussion. From where you sit on the cryptography side of things, can this really be run out of, let's say, an organization that's based in the United States? Or does this really require it to be, run by somebody who maybe is from a non-nuclear weapon state to get that credibility that you were talking about? Curious as to your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't see any reason why it couldn't be run out of the United States. Are the optics better? If it's not, perhaps yes. But how do you find somebody? I mean, it's a political question. It's absolutely a political question. I mean, do you find some neutral to do it? Don't know. I mean, I think what you want most out of the convening thing, I mean, NIST was a tremendous participant in the AES competition. It provided the framework, it provided the project management, it provided the vision, it provided the legal support, it provided the funding for the conferences, it provided the evaluation, it provided the ramp into the standards world. It was key.
Yeah, and it sets an extremely high bar, but a model for us to try and emulate. If I could come back real quick on the conversation we were having about post-quantum. I mean, you're someone who's played an incredibly important role in this community for so many years now. As we think about building agility into this concept. Are there things that you see that are potentially forthcoming on this side of the discussion, on the cryptographic side of the discussion, that we should be thinking about, or things that we could guard against? Or is that really going to be able to be anticipated by building in that agility that you were talking about?
I think that agility gives you the ability to get off the X when something unforeseen happens. We can expect that Murphy will attack the hotline system. And the idea is to be able to recover from that as quickly as possible, that it should be resilient. And if resilience is a requirement of the design going in, that's the best we can do at the moment.
And I think it's better than what may currently be in existence. I think what's very interesting is you noting the example from the past, that US Soviet hotline, and how the cryptographic elements of that may be a standard from which one could even begin to think about this. And looking to things like Signal for examples of things we can build off of to figure out what's needed and what we may be able to do away with. This has been an incredibly insightful conversation for us. I think the AES example is really one of a kind in terms of an international effort to develop something that people can really rely on. So we really value your personal insight into what made it work and what was challenging about it, because it really informs the work that we need to do.
Yeah, well, you're welcome about that. And I think the takeaway is that to establish a norm is a lot more than just to solve the technical problems. We also have to solve people problems, political problems, economic problems, schedule problems, and then send your system out into the world surrounded by this bodyguard of people who are invested in its success.
Those are the communities that we're trying to work with, and that we, I think, to a certain extent, need to build around this sort of a concept. So having the depth of a historical perspective, though, on AES will help us do that. So thank you again.
You're welcome. I look forward to attending the first hotline workshop.
Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome, Philip. Take care now.
And thanks again to Tom. As always, thanks to our listeners. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode of The Fourth Leg, and we will again be speaking with the retired head of security from Google, Eric Gross, where we'll be digging into the technical elements of what this CATALINK system should really be all about. Until then, subscribe to the pod, and thanks to everyone for listening. We look forward to hearing your feedback.